Hello there and welcome to Curve Theatre, and here we are today with Sean O'Connor, the director of The Entertainer, and Shane Ritchie, who's playing Archie Rice. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. So my name is Phil Lowe from East Midlands Theatre.
Hello, Phil Lowe from East Midlands Theatre.
Thank you very much. And today we're looking at this new production of The Entertainer, which is taking itself from the 1950s through to the early 1980s, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. So the play is written by John Osborne, originally known as a State of the Nation play, about a dysfunctional family, about bitter disappointments in life, about Britain being at war, and the fact that it splits families, rather like Brexit does nowadays, splits families' opinions and creates real problems there. So we have various characters. We have Archie Rice, who you're playing, and then we have the dad Billy, and we have Phoebe, who's your disappointed second wife, was hoping for more in life and income, I guess, as well. And your character also likes to not pay income tax. Is that still the case?
That's right. He's on the verge of celebrating his 21 years of not
paying,
and he's kind of wants to celebrate that. Yeah.
Excellent. So the original one was about the Suez. There's several threads in this play. The original one was about the Suez Crisis, which comes into sort of anti-war feeling. The daughter Jean goes to Trafalgar Square and she protesting about this. You've also got a son Michael who's gone off to fight in the Suez Crisis, and you've got a son Frank who in the original was against conscription, and he got put in jail for it. But when we see him in the play, he's acting as Archie's feed in his musical act. Excellent. So we've got this now set in the 1980s. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you chose to do that, Sean?
I love the play, and I think it's a genuine classic. It's one of the great dramas of the 20th century, and it's got one of the great parts in it. And I've seen several productions and loved them, but I've always thought that there's a barrier between the audience quite getting it, and that you have to work quite hard at it. And there are two hurdles, I think, and one of them is that you sort of need now an A-level in history to understand the Suez Crisis. And part of the issue with that is that when Osborne was writing it in 1957, the Suez Crisis was very present. It was in the newspapers, it was on the radio, or the wireless they probably call it then, and ultimately the audience watching it, consuming the play, would know all about it, and it's not written really into the play. It doesn't feel very present in the play, so it's hard to access. And then also there's the issue of music hall, which even in 1957 was on its way out, and in about 3 or 4 years' time the theatres that Osborne had researched with Olivier in the original production had all closed. So there are two barriers to getting it. And I wondered, is there a way of releasing this play from its history so that it could feel as urgent and accessible as the original production did?
Okay.
And now I thought quite carefully about where you could set it, and should it be, it's interesting, in America they did a TV version with Jack Lemmon, and they set it further back in the past. They set it in the Second World War, and I don't know if you know this, but Billy and Archie were a duo, like a sort of an American comedy duo. And I talked to the Osborne estate, and they said it's very interesting. In the UK, the play is always set in 1956. But in Europe, it's set in the present day, it's set during Afghanistan, it's set during the Iran crisis, and they are much more free with how they interpret it. And in many occasions it's played as a much more expressionist play, and Archie's much more like the MC from Cabaret, so with a sort of white face, and it's much more snarling, and it's much nastier, more sexually in your face, cruder, if you like. And I said, well, what about if we did something like that? And they were very excited about it. And there's also an issue that right now we're in the middle of a crisis about Britain's place in the world. That happened in 1956. It also happened in 1982 with the Falklands crisis. So you've got that parallel, and you've got an issue about cultural change, which is that in the early 80s, when alternative comedy came along, they outlawed the mother-in-law joke and those sexist, racist jokes that you'd regularly see on prime time Saturday evening television, like Seaside Special, or on ITV on The Comedians.
I remember those in my own life.
And so it seemed like there's an interesting cultural shift there about comedy and essentially a man realizing that a certain sort of culture is passing, and in the same way that there is what haunts this production is Brexit without ever talking about it. There's also the issue of Me Too and about whether Archie's not just a comedian who's old-fashioned, but a certain sort of man, and that certain sort of opinions about women or different races or sexualities have become outmoded. And I think that in many ways you could say that the biggest ghost that haunts this production is Me Too.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
It does answer my question. Very good. That's excellent. You've done that before, haven't you?
I haven't actually.
No, I'm hearing stuff for the first time.
Very good.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you very much. You mentioning about European theatre, I often go and see a lot of German theatre
Oh,
where
interesting.
your description about the white face and the snarly and the bit more aggression coming through, that's often a thing that they would build into their experimental
Oh yeah,
theatre.
I think interestingly, it's very in the same way that, for instance, Sarah Kane is really popular in Europe and not so popular in Britain, because it's called in-your-face theatre, isn't it? I think that The Entertainer is, when it's done in Europe, is much more. It's much more enjoyed by people that like Brechtian productions, which are not non-naturalistic. They're not kitchen sink. They're much more theatrical. They're much more in your face. And that they're a much more visceral experience when you see them, and I think that that's where we're going really, rather than a sort of traditional kitchen sink version of the play.
Okay, thank you very much. Shane,
Oh, yeah.
tell me about Archie.
Oh, Archie. Our version of Archie is very different. I suppose the one that people will recognise was the famous Laurence Olivier version. As Sean said, ours is set in 1982. And for me, where I grew up in London, my dad used to run working men's clubs. And so as a child, I would see comics every weekend that worked the club circuit around the UK. That were, I come from a big Irish family as well, so I'd see a lot of these comics who were like racist, sexist, homophobic, and I remember sitting watching them as a youngster and laughing, and not really know why I was laughing then, but then, when I went into the business as a comic in 1980, 1981, I worked with Archie Rice. I worked with a lot of these comics. I saw them when I worked at the holiday camps or when I toured theatres in the mid-80s, and I did shows like Live from the Palladium, Live from Piccadilly, Seaside Special, Summertime Special, and then I ended up working on the club circuit up and down the UK. So, and I remember comedy changing in the early 80s when I was in the early days of me doing stand-up and seeing the likes of the Comedy Store players, French and Saunders, Alexis Sale, Ben Elton, a lot of these comics coming through and doing something very different. And so I know who Archie Rice is. I know where his head's at. I know the material he does, which it didn't seem so offensive back then, but then if you think, it wasn't that long ago, in the early 80s, the black and white minstrel show was still on TV. And that's only like 35, 40 years ago.
No, but when you do look back at them, now you're like,
you just think, how did we even let that through on television, and how did anyone even find it entertaining? But the likes of your Mannings, Jim, I'm loath sometimes to mention Jim Davidson, but Jim was part of that whole club culture where it was homophobic, racist, sexist, and certainly Roy Chubby Brown, who's still touring now. But, and strangely enough, it still sells out. It's so bizarre. But anyway, so my Archie Rice is, like we know, he's set in 1982. He's in his mid-50s. He's a guy that's fallen from grace, in his 30s. It'd have been in the 60s. He was part of that whole, the Beatles had just come through. Comedy was new. Music hall was dead. Summer seasons were starting. The club circuit was still in its infancy. Bruce Forsyth was Tarbuck. All these comics. Ted Rogers was coming through, and that's what Archie was part of that movement. And they were homophobic, they were sexist, they were racist, there was the height of the mother-in-law jokes. I mean, even Les Dawson, look at Les Dawson, I was looking at something on YouTube the other day in the 80s on the Raw Variety Show, was the king of the mother-in-law gags. Something you certainly wouldn't get away with nowadays.
So in the text that I read, there's quite a lot of references to things, to names of things that would have been called in the 1950s, like Boogie Woogie. He mentions about the Boogie Woogie clubs, which is marginally racist in its own description. But then you've got much more harsher terms like Wog for the Egyptians, so the coloured people that were connected with the Suez Canal crisis in there. What are you doing, if anything, I don't know if it still works, given what you just said, in the script in terms of addressing those terms? Obviously, you can't make it all nice.
No, but we talk about the polls, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of transposing the material, I mean, in the same way that you have to change the imperial system to the metric system, and so a cake costs more in 1982 than it did in 1957. There are certain terms which I think the audience now are hypersensitive to, and therefore what you want to do is to express the offensiveness of it without offending the audience that are consuming it. So you want to make it clear without it being offensive in itself, and that's quite a delicate balance. But so, for instance, we haven't got the word "wog" in it, but we are retaining the offence, if you like, because we want it to be clear that he's a sexist, racist, homophobic man, and that what he does is represents a culture. And as Shane's just said, in some areas today, still, I mean, I went to a drag bar in Gran Canaria, and where there is a drag dwarf. It's called Sparkles. Okay. And what's interesting is it's full of middle-aged straight couples enjoying it, and the drag performers are really homophobic, they're really racist, and they're really misogynist. And it's almost like the audience, who are your charabang trippers to Gran Canaria, have the license on holiday to really enjoy themselves. And I think, you know, what's interesting about comedy is it is political in itself, because comedy is the comedy that we talk about in The Entertainer that Archie represents is usually the comedy of offence. It's about it's the comedy of difference and offence.
It's about targets, isn't it?
Yeah, and people enjoy laughing at somebody else's difference, and the cultural change in terms of alternative comedy is about not taking advantage of that, so what we're doing is we're having to dramatise that moment of change, which means you need to embrace the offence in some way, but it has to be palatable for a contemporary audience, which I think is hypersensitive to insensitivity.
And tough to do.
Yeah. So it's a really fine line, because you don't want to geld it to such an extent that it's completely. It doesn't make its point, but you want it to be clear that comedy has changed, that this is the moment that it changes.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Just to finish up, tell me you've got a nice cast, Sarah Crowe in the cast, and others.
Amazing cast.
Just tell me a little bit how that's all working. Good family to work with.
Brilliantly. I mean, Sarah, as you probably know, she's an extraordinary comedian. She's an Olivier Award-winning actress, and just was, as soon as I asked her if she'd be interested, she just jumped at the chance to work with Shane, to work on this play. Diana Vickers I had seen in the Wonderful Little Voice in the West End, and she's a very ballsy, committed young feminist, and Jean in the play is a ballsy, committed young feminist. And in this, it's interesting, in this version, Osborne wrote in the 80s, when he was thinking about the play in hindsight, he said, if I'd been writing it now, she'd have been a Queen in Common. And so we're benefiting from the movement of the play that all the characters have a more identifiable, accessible image. And in the 50s, Jean was a sort of slightly CND, slightly mumsy character, but now I think she's recognisably the sort of person that would be camping out at Waterloo Bridge the other week, that she has found her political voice.
Very good. Well, thanks very much, guys.
You're welcome, thank you.
Okay,
you very
enjoy
much.
your run.
Cheers,
and
buddy.
we look forward to seeing it on press night.
Brilliant.
Thanks for your
Cheers,
time.
Nice to see you.
All right, and you. Bye-bye.